This ID's been expired since 1994, the officer said with a chuckle, holding up the worn and frayed military card. The elderly man didn't say a word. He simply stood there, silent and still. Then the young lieutenant added with a smirk, "You want to get onto the base? You've got to be a real soldier." But just a few minutes later, the phone rang. The voice on the other end spoke a single, chilling sentence. "You're talking about the former commander of Special Forces Bravo team. You seriously didn't know who you were dealing with? Welcome to Uncovered Tales. Let's pull back the curtain on what really happened." Thomas Granger, about 80 years old, moved with the slow certainty of someone who'd long ago learned that rushing never helped anything get done right. He was slender, his frame wrapped in simple but meticulously clean clothes, creased khakis, a plain blue button-up, and a brown jacket that had clearly weathered countless seasons. For a man his age, his posture was strikingly straight, an unmistakable result of years of military discipline. On a crisp Veterans Day morning, Granger made his way toward the front gate of Fort Walker, a quiet Army base tucked into the Arizona desert. The base was holding its annual memorial ceremony, something Granger had never once attended, despite living just 30 meters away for the past 4 decades. Clutched in his right hand were 2 items, a military ID so old the corners had softened like the edge of a book passed down for generations, and a firm envelope sealed with what looked like official government tape. As he approached the security checkpoint, his face remained unreadable, eyes fixed forward, each step steady and deliberate. "Morning," Granger said calmly, his voice low but unmistakably clear. "I'm here to visit the memorial inside the base." Lieutenant Nolan, a 26-year-old officer assigned to guard duty, reached out his hand for the ID. Bright-eyed, career-minded, and growing restless from slow duty days, Nolan had been stationed at Fort Walker for less than a year. He took one glance at the card and couldn't hide his reaction. "Sir, this thing expired back in '94, he said, squinting at the faded print. A crooked smile tugged at his lips as he held the card up. "You're not seriously thinking this still works, are you?" Granger didn't respond. He just stood there, weather-beaten and calm, showing neither embarrassment nor offense, only a quiet kind of exhaustion that seemed etched deep in his bones. "We see this kind of thing all the time," came a voice from nearby. Sergeant Davis had wandered over from his post. He was built like a linebacker, his voice booming enough to carry down the checkpoint. "Folks trying to get in with ancient IDs or pretending they've got military history," Davis added dismissively. Granger said nothing. He simply reached out, polite and unbothered, to take his ID back from Nolan, who was now laughing under his breath. "Look," Nolan continued, now sounding smug, "if you want access to a military base, you need current credentials. Real ones. You need to be an actual soldier, not just someone clinging to an old card." By now, a few other guards and staff had gathered nearby, drawn by Davis's loud remarks. Most of them looked amused. A few glanced away, clearly uneasy, but none stepped in. Granger gave a single nod, slipped the ID and envelope back into his pocket, and turned to walk away. He didn't protest. He didn't explain. He simply accepted their judgment and began heading back toward the public lot, his steps slow but deliberate. From inside the guard booth, a young private named Evan Carter had quietly watched the entire scene unfold. Unlike the others, Evan hadn't found any of it funny. Something about the old man's quiet, unshakable composure had stuck with him. Most people would have snapped back, argued, maybe tried to plead their case. But Granger? He hadn't said a word in his defense. He just stood his ground with a kind of calm dignity that felt out of place in today's world. Evan had only been stationed at Fort Walker for 6 months. It was his first assignment after completing basic training. He came from a military family. His father had served for 25 years, and he'd grown up on stories of old-school warriors, the type of men who served in Vietnam or during the Cold War. Men who didn't brag, didn't posture, they just did the job and disappeared into history. Something in the way Granger carried himself felt exactly like that. After the rest of the team returned to their posts, Evan stepped into the back room and pulled out his phone. His uncle, Neil, worked at the Pentagon, specifically in personnel archives. If anyone could dig into a name, it was him. "Hey, Uncle Neil. It's Evan. I'm doing fine. Listen, something weird happened." An older man came by the gate today with a military ID from the '90s. The other guys laughed him off, said it was probably fake, but I don't know. He didn't act like someone faking it. "Can you look up a name for me?" "Thomas Granger. Probably commissioned sometime in the '70s or earlier." As Evan ended the call, he looked out the window. Granger hadn't left. He was sitting quietly on a bench just outside the gate, like he was waiting for what Evan couldn't say. When everyone turns their back, only conscience remains, Evan whispered, a phrase his father used to say often. Word of what happened at the gate traveled fast across the base's morning shift. Marie Alvarez, who'd worked in Fort Walker's cafeteria for over 3 decades, overheard a few of the guards laughing about the old guy with the ancient ID as they poured coffee into to-go mugs. What did the man look like? Marie asked, wiping her hands on her apron with a practiced swipe. Older guy, probably around 80. Pretty skinny. Walked like a steel rod, back straight as a ruler, one of the guards replied. Had some ancient ID from '94. Can you believe that? As soon as she heard that, Marie's entire demeanor shifted. Was he wearing a brown jacket? Kept to himself? Didn't say much even when pushed? Yeah, that's him. Wait, you know this guy? Marie gave a slow, thoughtful nod. I've seen him once. Just once. It was back in '89 during the weapons depot fire. 3 men were trapped inside. That man, whoever he is, ran into the smoke without hesitation and pulled them out, one at a time. I never caught his name, but I never forgot that face. One of the guards raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Seriously, Marie? That'd make him some kind of war hero. Heroes don't get turned away at base gates. Marie shrugged with a quiet certainty. Believe what you want. But if you don't trust me, ask Colonel Reynolds. He was one of the men that guy pulled from the fire. The story started spreading like wildfire. A young communications officer who'd been nearby when Marie shared her memory snapped a blurry photo of Granger sitting on the bench just outside the gate. He posted it on the base's internal messaging system with the caption, "Anyone recognize this veteran? Got turned away at the gate. Marie says he saved 3 lives during the '89 depot fire." Replies started pouring in almost instantly. Pretty sure that's the guy in the old black and white photo in Colonel Reynolds' office. My dad served in the '70s, he swore Thomas Granger was a legend, but we always thought he'd passed away. Wasn't there a Granger who got a top-secret commendation during Vietnam? Meanwhile, Evan Carter sat near the staff phone, nerves on edge. 20 minutes after his call to the Pentagon, the phone rang, sharp and insistent. He picked it up on the first ring. Private Carter speaking. This is Colonel Mercer with the Pentagon. I need the officer in charge of your security checkpoint immediately. Put me on speaker. Evan's pulse kicked up as he turned toward Nolan. Sir, it's the Pentagon. They're asking for you directly. Lieutenant Nolan adjusted his posture, tugging at his uniform jacket as he stepped forward and picked up the line. This is Lieutenant Nolan. Lieutenant, this is Colonel Alan Mercer, Special Operations Historical Division. You're now on speaker. I need you to listen closely. The entire room quieted, tension rising with every second. Colonel Mercer's voice came through like a hammer. The man you denied entry is retired Colonel Thomas E. Granger. He served as commander of Special Forces Bravo Team from 1971 to 1979. Despite the expiration on that ID, his clearance is still valid under General Order 117A. Sergeant Davis, who had been lounging casually against the wall, immediately snapped to attention. Lieutenant Nolan turned pale. Sir, I had no idea, Nolan started. Clearly, Mercer replied, cutting him off before he could continue. Colonel Granger was attempting to attend the annual memorial service, a right he has more than earned. This man led the most decorated extraction unit during Vietnam and later orchestrated the Cambodia POW rescue mission in 1975. A wave of shock rippled through the room. That mission was legendary, though shrouded in secrecy. Whispers had floated around for decades about a small elite team that infiltrated deep into enemy territory and brought home 28 American POWs without losing a single soldier. We've already dispatched a vehicle to your location, Mercer continued. Until it arrives, I suggest you treat Colonel Granger with the respect he deserves. Right on cue, a black military SUV rolled up to the gate. 3 high-ranking officers stepped out with urgent determination. One of them, a full-bird colonel covered in combat ribbons, walked directly toward the checkpoint. I'm Colonel Bennett. Where's Thomas Granger? Nolan, still speechless, pointed toward the bench outside. Without another word, Bennett gave a sharp nod and made his way toward Granger, the other officers close behind. Inside the booth, Evan stepped up to the window, watching intently as Colonel Bennett stopped in front of Granger and snapped a crisp salute. Granger, calm as ever, slowly rose to his feet and returned the gesture, steady and precise. A few quiet words were exchanged, firm handshakes followed, and Granger gave a subtle nod as he reached into his jacket and handed the envelope over to Colonel Bennett. About 15 minutes later, Granger returned with the officers, this time heading straight back to the checkpoint. Lieutenant Nolan and Sergeant Davis were no longer relaxed, both now stood stiff as boards, posture perfect, eyes forward. "These men will be entering the base under my direct authorization," Colonel Bennett stated firmly, his voice brooking no argument. As the group moved past the checkpoint, Bennett came to a brief stop and turned toward the security team. "Just so you know," he said coolly, "that ID card you laughed at? It has a built-in transmitter. Colonel Granger activates it once a year on Veterans Day to let us know he's still with us. That signal is something we watch for." Nolan swallowed, clearly rattled. "Sir, I didn't realize." "No, you didn't," Bennett replied without a hint of softness. "You saw an elderly man with an outdated ID and made assumptions. That man led missions you'll never be cleared to even read about. He saved more American lives than everyone standing at this checkpoint put together." Once the officers and Granger had disappeared from view, Evan leaned toward Nolan. "Sir, what exactly just happened?" Nolan dragged a hand down his face and let out a long breath. "We just disrespected a man who should have had a statue in his name. A legend. That's what happened." Davis shook his head, stunned. "The Cambodia rescue mission. That's like finding out you flipped off Rambo." Later that morning, Evan's phone rang again. His uncle, Neil, was on the line, his voice clipped and tense. "Evan, do you understand who that man was? Thomas Granger isn't just another retired officer. After Vietnam, he led the most covert extraction unit in U.S. military history. Some of his missions are still completely blacked out in the archives." Evan was still reeling from it all. Why would someone like that let himself be turned away? He didn't push back, didn't even protest. There was a long pause before Neil finally answered. "Because men like Granger don't need to prove anything, not to you, not to anyone. They know who they are. That's what made them so effective. No ego, just purpose." For them, it was always about the mission. As the hours passed, more pieces of the story began surfacing through whispered conversations and unofficial reports. Turns out Granger had been living a quiet life for decades in a small Arizona town. He had never given interviews, never attended military reunions, and always declined any public honors. And yet every year, without fail, he wrote letters, personal notes to the families of the men he lost under his command. The very names now etched in stone at the memorial inside the base. For 40 years, he had penned those letters. But until today, he had never delivered them in person. Today was different. "And I don't know about you, but that part? That hit me hard. If that moved you too, type respect." By midday, Fort Walker was a hive of activity like no one had ever seen before. The base commander had issued a rare emergency protocol. "Prepare an honor reception for Colonel Thomas Granger." Word spread like wildfire. Soldiers who just an hour earlier had been sweeping floors or sorting supplies were suddenly lining up along the main road. Uniforms were straightened, brass was polished, and an honor guard was quickly assembled. At the heart of it all was the memorial site, Granger's original destination, now being ready to receive him with full military distinction. Lieutenant Nolan, still visibly shaken from that morning's encounter, stood at his post, watching as the procession made its way back toward the entrance. Granger hadn't changed clothes. He wore the same unassuming outfit, khaki pants, blue shirt, worn brown jacket. He had turned down the offer of dress blues. Yet even in his civilian clothes, there was something undeniable about him. The way he walked, the quiet authority in his gaze. It was enough to make every soldier there snap to attention the second he came into view. One by one, they saluted, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Not because of the uniform, but because of the man. Granger responded in kind, raising his hand with measured grace. The salute was second nature, etched into his muscle memory like breathing. Across the base's internal network, messages lit up. "Urgent, all personnel, be advised, Colonel Thomas E. Granger, Ret., is on base for memorial visitation. Full honors protocol is now in effect. Alert, Pentagon confirms incident involves a highly decorated Special Forces commander. Reminder, media blackout active. No outside communication regarding Colonel Granger's presence." Meanwhile, on veteran forums linked to Fort Walker, word spread like wildfire. "Granger's alive. The Thomas Granger. I thought he'd passed years ago. My dad served under him in '73, said Granger was the best leader he ever knew. This is the guy who never left anyone behind. Not once." The base's internal bulletin board lit up fast, flooded with first-hand stories from veterans who had once served under Thomas Granger's command. "I was a radio operator in Vietnam when Granger led an extraction mission. We were pinned down for 3 days, 72 hours straight. He didn't sleep, didn't complain, he just kept us alive until help came. Granger turned down a Silver Star in 1976. Told us the mission itself was all the reward he needed. I've never met anyone who lived the warrior code like Thomas Granger. Not before him, not since. After being officially relieved from his post, Lieutenant Nolan went looking for Granger. He found him standing alone at the memorial wall, gazing at a section honoring operations in Southeast Asia. There was something solemn in the way he stood, quiet, focused, not moving an inch. Nolan approached cautiously. "Colonel Granger, sir," he started, his voice low and tentative. "I owe you an apology. The way I acted this morning, it was out of line. I judged you without knowing who you were." Granger slowly turned to face him, eyes steady, expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, just studied the young lieutenant in silence. Then, finally, he said, "You were doing your job, Lieutenant." "No, sir," Nolan replied, shaking his head. "I might have followed protocol, but I wasn't really doing my duty. My job is to protect this base, and to show respect to those who've served it. And on both counts, I failed." Granger considered that for a moment. Then he said quietly, "It's not your fault. It's how you were trained, to see papers before people." Nolan furrowed his brow. "I'm not sure I follow, sir." Granger explained, "Back in my day, we were taught to look beyond someone's credentials, to judge the person, not the paperwork. That lesson's been lost somewhere over the years." That hit Nolan hard. For the first time, he realized just how much he had relied on systems and rules to make decisions, without really seeing the individual in front of him. By early afternoon, the base commander had arranged an unexpected assembly inside the main auditorium. Over 200 personnel, many of them young recruits who had never even heard the name Thomas Granger before that morning, filed into their seats. Senior officers stood along the walls, silent and attentive. Then the base commander, a two-star general who had flown in as soon as word reached him, stepped up to the podium. "This afternoon we have a rare privilege," he announced. "With us is Colonel Thomas Granger. His service record remains partially classified to this day. Colonel Granger has agreed to speak with our newest generation of soldiers." A soft murmur ran through the room as Granger approached the stage. He walked slowly, with purpose, every step deliberate. Even in old age, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had led others through war. He reached the podium and paused. No rush. He scanned the faces before him, many of them wide-eyed, unfamiliar with the name but clearly aware something significant was happening. "I didn't come here for any recognition," he began, his voice quiet, but it reached every corner of the room. "I came to honor the ones who didn't make it home. The names on that wall outside, that's who I'm here for." He let the words settle in the silence before continuing. "You asked me to talk to these young recruits, so I'll say this. Honor doesn't come from your uniform, your rank, or the card in your wallet. It's in how you act when no one's watching. It's in the promises you keep, especially when it's inconvenient or painful to keep them." No one spoke. No one moved. "I've never talked publicly about my service," he went on. "Not because it was classified, though much of it was, but because the work mattered more than the person doing it. The men I served with understood that. We didn't need medals. We had each other's respect, and that was more than enough." He looked toward the back of the auditorium where Lieutenant Nolan stood quietly. "That young man at the gate this morning, he acted based on what he could see in the moment. And I don't blame him for that. But I'd ask you all to remember this. The most important things in a person? They're not always obvious. You have to look deeper." After the speech, Granger made his way down from the stage. Officers, enlisted soldiers, and civilians all lined up to shake his hand. Among them was Sergeant Davis, whose face was tight with emotion as he stepped forward. "Sir, my father was stationed at Cambran Bay in '72. He always said a colonel named Granger was the one who led the extraction that saved his whole unit." "Was that you?" Granger studied him for a moment. "What was your father's name, son?" "Daniel Davis, sir. 5th Infantry." Granger gave a slow, knowing nod. "I remember that mission." "Your father?" "He was brave. Helped carry 2 wounded soldiers all the way to the evac point." Davis blinked, taken aback. He never mentioned that part. Granger offered a faint smile. "The truly brave ones rarely do." Davis's eyes widened, stunned. "He never told me any of that." "Most brave men don't," Granger replied softly, without pride, just truth. As the afternoon unfolded, something unexpected happened at the security post. After speaking with his superiors, Lieutenant Nolan quietly commissioned a bronze plaque to be placed right at the checkpoint where Granger had been turned away that morning. Its inscription was simple but powerful. Granger Gate, in honor of quiet valor. Later that day, as Granger prepared to depart the base, a senior intelligence officer flown in from Washington approached him discreetly. "Colonel, there's something you deserve to know," the officer began in a hushed tone. "All those letters you've been writing over the years to the families, they didn't go unread. They were delivered. Every single one." For the first time that day, Granger's face shifted, genuine surprise etched across it. "But I never mailed them," he said, clearly confused. "You didn't have to. You wrote the names and addresses. That was enough. Each year, when you activated your ID transmitter, our system flagged it. We'd quietly send someone to check in on you. They found the letters, and we made sure they reached the families." Granger stood frozen, taking in the weight of what that meant. For decades, he had believed those letters were nothing more than a personal ritual, his way of remembering the fallen. He had no idea they had found the people who needed them most. The Sullivans in Oregon, the Williamses in Georgia. The officer nodded solemnly. "All of them, every year. Some families have kept every letter you ever sent. They still read them." As the sun dropped behind the desert hills, casting long golden light across Fort Walker, Granger returned to the memorial wall one last time. His hand reached out, gently brushing over the etched names of those who never made it home. A small group of officers stood quietly at a respectful distance, allowing the old colonel his moment. When he finally turned away from the wall, he approached the base commander and said something that would later be etched into the new bronze plaque at the gate. "I came only to visit those I couldn't save." That evening, as Granger was escorted out with full military honors, Lieutenant Nolan stood tall at the gate, offering a salute sharper and more reverent than any he'd ever given. As the vehicle rolled past, Granger looked back, locked eyes with Nolan, and returned the gesture with steady, dignified precision. In that brief, wordless exchange was an understanding that washed away the morning's failure. A quiet acknowledgement that honor, once earned, never fades with time. Has there been a time in your life when justice came late, but still came through? In the months that followed, Thomas Granger returned to the same quiet life he had lived for decades in that small Arizona town. He declined every interview. He politely turned down military honors offered in the wake of the incident. But his story had already taken flight. Within military circles, it became known as the Pentagon call incident. It was quickly adopted into training curricula at officer academies across the country. Though Granger's name was never publicly disclosed at his request, his experience became a powerful case study on the difference between blindly following protocol and truly understanding what leadership means. And Nolan, true to his word, ensured the bronze plaque was installed permanently. Its message was exactly what Granger had asked for. Honor endures long after credentials expire. Granger's old military ID, the one that started it all, was placed inside a protective case in Fort Walker's historical archive. Beside it, a simple placard read, "This weathered piece of plastic belonged to one of the most decorated special operations commanders in modern U.S. history. An expired ID, but honor that never will." The following Veterans Day, a familiar black SUV pulled up to Granger's modest home. But this time he was ready. The visit had become a new tradition, a quiet, yearly salute to a man who had never stopped serving in his own way. As for Private Evan Carter, the young soldier whose phone call had changed everything, he received an unexpected transfer to officer candidate school, personally recommended by a Pentagon colonel. At his graduation ceremony, Evan stood at the podium and shared the moment that redefined his understanding of service. Never judge a warrior by the expiration date on his ID. Judge him by the way he lives his values, especially when no one is looking. Years later, when asked about that unforgettable Veterans Day, Lieutenant Nolan, now promoted to Captain Nolan, would reflect. "Some badges don't need to be worn. They're already engraved in blood, sacrifice, and courage." And to every new officer under his command, he'd always add, "Be careful who you overlook. Sometimes the person you dismiss is the one who once shielded you from things you'll never even know existed." As for Colonel Thomas Granger, he never stopped writing those letters. And now he knew they were finally being received. In his final letter, discovered on his desk after he passed at the age of 89, he wrote, "Honor doesn't fade. It only needs one person to remember. Justice may not always be on time, but it always arrives." So don't stop doing what's right, especially when it's hard. Have you ever stood firm when the world stood against you? Share it below. And don't forget to subscribe to Uncovered Tales, where stories of truth, sacrifice, and justice remind us why it all still matters. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in doing the right thing again.